Zahir Galt here, and so far in the series, we've talked about how to build the studio, recording, and mixing, but there's one step left to finalize and perfect your song, and that's mastering. With good ears, a handful of tools, and a little practice, you can achieve exactly the sound you imagined in your head when we first started this process.
Mastering has meant a few things over the years. For a long time, it referred to the processing of a tape recording from the studio session in order to turn it into a mastered disc. The mastering engineer's job has also long included managing the relationship of the songs over the whole album. In the age of digital distribution, and with the prevalence of single-by-single releases, mastering now often just refers to the final stage of processing on a song, needed to maximize its volume, enhance its stereo field, idealize the overall frequency balance, and finish the song in its target format. Since this accounts for the vast majority of mastering done today, that's what we're going to talk about. The first weapon in the mastering engineer's arsenal is compression. The most common way to use a compressor in mastering is to catch the big fluctuations in volume, or peaks, that happen intermittently in a song. This will constrain the dynamic range of the song and allow for the overall level of the track to be brought up. To achieve this kind of compression, we want to set the threshold to a level above the average volume of the music. That way the compressor will just catch and level out peaks that jump out. To get the settings right, start with the ratio high, the attack and release very fast, and get the compressor compressing everything. Then dial back the threshold until the compressor only activates on the big peaks. Fab-Filter's Pro C makes this task really easy, since you can simply look to see where peaks are being chopped off, and by how much, with the visualization. Now dial back the ratio to find a balance between managing the peaks and maximizing volume, and retaining punch and liveliness in the track. For this kind of task, it's common to see ratios from 2:1 up to 8:1 or so. Finally, I like to use a hard knee for this. The next important mastering tool is EQ. A surgically precise EQ is recommended because we're working with the whole track, and we no longer have access to the individual instruments in a mix. This means we need the precision to pinpoint specific details with as little collateral impact on other areas as possible. Fab-Filter's Pro Q is perfect for mastering. It allows points to be made anywhere in the frequency spectrum, with cues and shapes that are entirely user-selectable. Further, for each point, I can choose whether it applies to the whole track, just the left or the right channel, or we can even enter into mid-side mode, which allows filters to affect the middle or the sides of the mix independently, which is how I'm going to work now. So typically, we think of a stereo signal as split between a left and a right channel. But mid-side processes a stereo signal by splitting it into sum and difference channels. The sum channel is any audio signal which is present equally in the left as the right side of the mix, which we'll then perceive as occupying the center of the mix, hence mid. The difference channel is everything else. Basically, the stuff on the sides of your mix. Okay, since bass frequencies require a lot of energy to produce, we really need the full benefit of both speakers doing the work. Meaning, we mainly want bass present in the mid, and so we're gonna cut bass out of the sides. Using a low cut, we're gonna roll off the bass starting around 100 Hz. Now I'm gonna add a point to the mid to bring out the bass and the kick drum that live in the center of my mix. I'm also going to cut entirely the subsonic frequencies, the ones we can't hear. I end up with a powerful low end, and I avoid a muddy stereo picture by cutting some of the bass in the sides. In further adjustments, I'm going to do a small dip in the mid around 350 Hz, just a touch to clear out some of the bulk that can accumulate. You don't want to take away too much, or we lose the warmth. Finally, boosting the highs on just the sides a couple dBs gives a mix a brilliant sheen and opens up the stereo field. Finally, one of the most powerful features of Pro Q is the ability to listen to only the area you're affecting with your filter. You can use this to isolate problem frequencies that you need to attenuate, or you can use it to hunt around for those areas in the mix you want to boost and enhance. On the topic of problem frequencies, one common issue you'll want to watch out for is sibilance. That's when a harsh, piercing sound, often occurring on S's in a vocal, sometimes the T's and D's, or even on instruments like cymbals or snares, pop out of a mix disproportionately and become tiring on the ear. You can treat sibilant sounds with EQ by pulling down the offending frequencies, but being that sibilance is usually just intermittent, all the moments where sibilance is not a problem would then also become dimmed as a result. A much better method to deal with sibilance is simply to use a de-esser. That'll squelch sibilance only when the frequency band overshoots the threshold. Often de-essers are used at the mixing stage on individual tracks, but sometimes the effect of mastering compression and EQ, while otherwise having beneficial effects, can make sibilance apparent where it wasn't noticeable before. Fab-Filter's Pro DS has features that make it work brilliantly on a single track, but a couple additions that make it extremely powerful on a whole mix. First, we have a user-selectable band to hone in on problem frequencies, and we can click Audition to isolate the frequencies we're de-essing and make sure we're actually catching the problem sounds we intended to treat. For a vocal track, the single vocal setting has an intelligent algorithm to track S's in a vocal, but for mastering and broader purposes, you'll want to select All Round. The wideband setting here sets Pro DS up to lower the whole of the signal when sibilance is detected. That can be really natural when de-essing a vocal, but for a whole mix, it's probably not ideal. Split band will just attenuate high frequencies, leaving the rest of the signal untouched. That's what you'll want to use for mastering. The stereo linking settings are very important. If you know you're trying to remove sibilance from a snare or a lead vocal, for example, both of which are generally panned dead center, we can set Pro DS to work on the mid only and remove sibilance from the center of the mix while leaving the sides entirely alone. Alternatively, maybe we really love the effect we're getting from a high shelf EQ on the sides, but occasionally sibilant sounds popped out as a result, maybe from cymbals, for example. We could rein that in using DS only processing the sides, acting as a kind of high-frequency limiter, clamping down only when things got out of hand. Look Ahead allows de-essing to start up to 15 milliseconds before the audio even exceeds the threshold. That way you can make sure to catch the whole of the sibilant sound, transients and all. The two most important dials, of course, are the ones you use to actually trigger de-essing. Adjust threshold so that only the sounds you want to de-emphasize are lighting up in green on the meter. Range scales the gain reduction, so you use it to change how much de-essing to apply. For this song, sibilance isn't really much of a problem, so we're going to use very mild settings. Mastering also often includes saturation of some kind. Tape and tubes distort audio in a way that add warmth, crunch, and character that can be very desirable. Saturation also allows us to maximize volume in a unique way. By adding harmonics overall, we increase the average level of a signal. To that end, Saturn is an extremely unique and flexible distortion modeling plugin, and while it's most often used in the mixing stage, I find it can be powerful in mastering too, giving rise to colorful solutions that aren't achievable through other saturation methods. It comes loaded with distinct types of distortion, most notably for mastering, tape and tube saturation. And here's where it gets interesting. A distinct saturation can be used across different user-selectable frequency bands. For example, I happen to like the softening effect tape has on high-frequency transients in a mix, and I like the sense of warmth tube saturation has on the mids. Finally, I don't often saturate lows much at all. To achieve this in Saturn, I simply set up the crossover bands, choose the saturation type for each band. For mastering, you'll most often want the clean or warm tube or tape settings, or the gentle saturation settings, and then dial in the desired amount of drive for each band. In mastering, a little goes a long way. And all of a sudden, I've created a custom saturation device, one that conforms precisely to my personal tastes and works like no hardware device that even exists. It's worth mentioning that there's not always a need for saturation. In fact, that's true for everything we've talked about so far. Each track is different and will require its own adjustments, which may need some tools and not others. Well, there is one tool that's in basically every single mastering chain, a brick wall limiter, whose primary function is to ensure that the volume absolutely never goes over the maximum allowable level, 0 dBFS. This also gives us one more chance to wring out a few decibels of loudness of our track, should we need it, and in doing so, further shape the dynamics. And for all of this, Fab-Filter's limiter Pro-L is exceptionally powerful, and its detailed metering makes setting it up to get the volume right very easy. The main scrolling display shows us with one graph the input level in bright gray, output level, the darker gray, gain reduction in red, and the RMS level, the white line, which shows, instead of momentary peak levels, an idea of how loud our track is perceived over time. There are also more compact meters on the side. The brighter LEDs in front show us the RMS level, and behind we have the peak momentary levels. Here, Fab-Filter has 6 different metering modes. We're going to focus on the K metering, which is an audio level measuring technique designed to help achieve consistent levels and appropriate dynamic range based on the type of material. There are 3 different K settings, each used for a different purpose. K12 has the smallest dynamic range and should be used for heavily compressed broadcast material. K14 has a wider dynamic range. It's probably the most widely used of the bunch, and it's meant for music in most genres. K20 is reserved for film and classical music, or any material that has a very wide dynamic range. Since my song is largely a rock track, despite some purely orchestral passages, we're going to choose K14. The first thing to note is that in K metering, 0 dB is not the top of the scale, as it usually is in most digital meters. In K14, 0 dB actually corresponds to minus 14 dBFS, where dBFS is the digital scale, which your DAW probably uses, where 0 dBFS is the maximum possible digital level. Anyway, K metering is so useful because it makes determining appropriate loudness simple. Generally, you'll want your track hovering around 0, moving into the yellow during loud passages, and only ever bouncing into the red during the loudest portions of the song. Simply use the gain slider in Pro-L to bring your song into the appropriate range. For quick and dirty mastering, you can call it a day there. The default settings in Pro-L are really good. You can also choose one of the many other presets they have, and if you leave the lock clicked, it will ensure the loudness remains equivalent between the presets, so you can make an objective choice as to which you actually prefer. But there are a host of additional features you can adjust should you have a more precise endpoint in mind, in which case, click Advanced Settings. The first setting to look at is the style of limiting. Pro-L comes with 4 distinct algorithms with different characteristics. Transparent is meant to leave the source as uncolored as possible and avoid pumping effects. Should you want that, as is sometimes desirable in certain genres, choose punchy. Dynamic mode enhances transients before limiting. It's a great way to retain the dynamic power of the source, and it's ideal for rock tracks, so that's what we're going to choose. The last mode is all round, which is basically meant to be a safe setting that should work on just about everything. Look ahead determines the time in advance of transients the limiter will get to react. So with short look aheads, the limiter won't have as much time to react to transients, and so the result is more perceived loudness. But depending on the material and settings chosen, there's a greater risk of some distortion. Less than 0.1 millisecond look aheads approach a hard clipping behavior, which will absolutely introduce distortion, but is sometimes just right. Longer look-aheads will help to avoid distortion, but at the compromise of some perceived loudness. While the look-ahead setting deals with transients, attack and release deal with the leveling stage of Pro L thereafter. Attack determines how quickly this stage kicks in, release, how long the recovery of this stage takes. A good place to start for a track like this is a relatively short look ahead, less than about 0.5 milliseconds. I'd start with the attack and release around the middle, and then fine-tune from there. Now, when limiting a stereo signal, if you process both channels simultaneously, the stereo image, the relationship of panned elements, will remain consistent. However, in the case of a short-lived peak happening in just one channel, oftentimes you'll get a better result if it's removed in only the channel where it occurs. The transient knob controls the stereo linking on short-lived peaks like that, and you'll usually want a value under 100% to allow single-channel transient peaks to be dealt with independently. The release knob controls channel linking on the release of the limiter. You'll always be safest with a level of 100%. Bringing the level down may introduce some shifting in the stereo image as channels are processed independently. But then again, you may choose to lower this setting in instances where the resultant stereo shift is not troublesome, and then thereby allows for a greater gain increase. I'm going to leave it at 100% for this track. Now, the final stage of mastering deals with choosing the target format. For CDs, you'll need to bounce a 16-bit WAV file, and most of the electronic delivery vendors expect this as their source as well. To get into this target format, I'll be reducing the resolution from my 24-bit project audio. This means truncating the least significant bits of every sample. This results in what's called quantization distortion. And I know that sounds like something a spaceship would use to fly at light speed. It's actually just a jagged fizzy sound we don't want in our recordings. Dithering is a way to deal with quantization distortion. It adds white noise to the audio signal of a level less than the least significant bit before truncating to the lower bit depth. To say that with less jargon, we're substituting a tiny amount of low-level noise, which sounds more like quiet tape hiss, instead of the quantization distortion. The noise shaping allows us to choose what kind of noise to add. Certain algorithms have been designed to suit different objectives, shifting the noise to various places in our hearing that aren't so sensitive. But remember, the level on which dither noise exists is so low that I wouldn't stress very much about this decision. It is worth saying, though, only apply dither if Pro L is the last effect in your chain and post fader. Now, after we've gotten the track to sound just how we want, we're ready for an export. Make sure to choose the same bit depth as we selected in Pro L, since our target format is CD or online vendors. That's 16-bit, and we'll choose 44.1 kilohertz as the sample rate, which is the standard there as well.
Okay, that's mastering, and how to make music, the series will continue. Post in the comments with any questions, subscribe so you don't miss the future videos, and as always, thanks for watching. I'm Saher Galt. I'll see you next time.